Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. The Joint Republican Caucus wanted to have this announcement today to further discuss the governor's budget. As everyone knows, the governor has many months in order to prepare and present his budget, and a number of comments came out once it was immediately introduced that almost gave accolades to the budget, expressed pleasure to see that there is economic incentives to drive growth. But the caucus has finally gotten an opportunity after the last week to evaluate the budget through our own resources, and many of the committees also have received the detailed analysis from the Department of Legislative Services. So we wanted to take an opportunity to go over some of our findings and talk to the people of Maryland and let them know that after a week of evaluation, that this deal seems to be getting worse and worse for Marylanders. And I think it's important that after the governor's sales pitch, we take time to let people know that there are certainly a number of cuts, a number of increases, and a number of maneuvers that should be concerning to all Marylanders. So today we're going to have some of our members give some more detailed analysis of different topics within the budget, but I'm going to go over a couple things very quickly that we talked about from the high notes. One of the first things that we heard from the governor was that this budget was going to be balanced. The $3 billion deficit was going to be balanced through $2 billion in cuts and $1 billion in revenue enhancements or taxes. As we found out, and as we see from the graph up here, that's not actually accurate. There are $1.3 billion in cuts, $1.3 billion in new taxes, and $800 million in revenue and budget maneuvers. There are changes to the tax brackets and the actual income tax. There are 10 different brackets in the governor's budget. Of those 10 brackets, the tax rate was only lowered in one bracket and raised in 5 brackets, including the lowest earners and the highest earners. Those over $500,000 and what we are calling the half millionaires tax. It's very equivalent to what Governor O'Malley did a number of years back with the millionaire tax. The problem with that type of tax, it one, hurts our job creators, and those that have the means have been seen to leave the state of Maryland, which becomes very concerning as well. There is also a maneuver that pushes $144 million down to the counties. So as we continue to hear cries from the Democrats about what the Trump administration may do as far as funding and cutting funding to the states, it seems like the state itself has no problem pushing down additional spending requirements to the counties. We've also taken a look at the structural outlook. As you know, we've had a $3 billion deficit this year. Funding for the blueprint runs out in fiscal year 28. According to the governor's budget, there will be a $4.8 billion deficit in FY28. His budget, if everything in the budget is approved, the way it's submitted, that includes combined reporting that many have been against and don't think that that will end up passing, it would actually reduce the structural deficit to $1.8 billion. 2029 is currently $5.3 billion. It would be reduced to 2.7. In 30, it would be $6 billion deficit, reduced to $3.4 billion. Again, if everything goes forward, the important thing to recognize with respect to the blueprint, question was asked of the analysts, if the blueprint were not required spending, what would the deficit, the structural deficit be? The response was $700 million a year, which is a completely manageable number that we think the budget should be with respect to trying to push out some of the items on blueprint. There was also a few surprises in the budget. One that's being talked about a lot right now, and that's the Child Victims Act. In the budget, it only recognizes that that is a concern, We've seen reports that say that there could be 3,500 claims with a maximum payout of $890,000. Quick math says that that's a $3 billion problem that we could be facing before we get out of session. I understand we're trying to make some changes to limit that payout, but that again was a surprise that was in there. There was also not in the budget, but needs to be taken care of before we leave, is the state's requirement for the Family and Medical Leave Insurance Program. Again, businesses are being forced to take 0.9% of payroll, divide it 50-50 between employer and employees. The state will have to do that same type of maneuver with state employees as well, which again could cost up to $2 billion. That has not been addressed in the budget either. So there are a number of concerns, I said, that we've been able to unturn through both of our analysis and our work on the budget. We're going to again explain some more of those in detail. Next is going to be Leader Jason Buckle, that's going to give some details on the budget and tax increases. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon. It's pretty obvious that last week, a week or so ago, Governor Moore did really an excellent job of saying the words of this budget is going to provide tax cuts for a lot of folks that all of us on this stage would like to see get tax cuts. We think that middle-class Marylanders are taxed too much. At the state level, the local level, property taxes, sales taxes, it's hard. It's really hard to stay and be middle class here in the state of Maryland. There were talks of tax cuts for corporations. We're going to eliminate the inheritance tax. But when you look at for every tax cut or tax break that was provided, there seems to be sometimes even more tax burden placed upon those same individuals and job creators. We've counted so far at least 18 individual tax and fee increases proposed to fund the governor's budget. And as Senator Hershey mentioned, it just simply would be disingenuous to suggest that this is a balance of actual cuts to programs with new revenues in the 2-to-1 ratio that Governor Moore was talking about a week or so ago. That chart that you see, that wasn't made up by the Republican Party. That's part of the official Department of Legislative Services review of the budget. And what it says is that we're raising 1.3, some of their data says $1.4 billion a year in new taxes and fees every year. Over the length of the budget forecast, it adds up to more than $6 billion in new taxes and fees. The cuts that you see in that chart amounting to around 1.3 billion, so it would be sort of a 40-40 mix. One of the biggest things that includes is we're not putting in roughly $420 million to the rainy day fund. So the cut doesn't mean we're cutting spending. The cut doesn't mean we're cutting programs. The cut doesn't mean we're cutting personnel. The cut means we're going to stop saving for the rainy day. We're going to stop saving for the recession that ultimately will come, because that's economic cycles, it happens. That is a huge percentage of what the cuts allegedly are. And any attempt to sort of couch this budget as a tax cut package is just simply inaccurate. We are raising taxes on businesses. How do we know that? Because the Department of Legislative Services scores it that way and suggests that businesses are going to pay, in the aggregate, well over $100 million a year more in new taxes. That doesn't make any sense when you say, I want an economic growth budget and I want to encourage and incentivize businesses and job creators to come here, instead of Virginia, where they're not talking about tax increases, instead of Pennsylvania, where they're not talking about tax increases in Richmond and in Harrisburg. We're talking about them here in Annapolis because we have a spending problem. There's also a variety of tax increases. I don't make $700,000 a year. I don't know very many people who do, or $500,000 a year. We don't stand up here and weep for people who've been successful. We're proud of them for being successful. They contribute to our economy and our state. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people who have those income levels and will pay these higher taxes are small businesses. They're people who are organized as limited liability companies, and they get a pass-through. What that means is on December 31st, at the end of the year, if in your limited liability company, your small restaurant, your plumbing company, your construction contractor with 3 and 4 employees, if you close on December the 31st with more than $500,000 in your bank account, that money is all imputed to you as if it were income. And so you're going to be among the 1 out of every 5 Maryland families under the governor's own analysis Nearly 1 out of every 5 Maryland families will have a tax increase under his proposal. There's a variety of things in this package that frankly are some of the biggest tax increases ever proposed. The bottom line is, for us, I think we're happy that Governor Moore is one of the first Democrats I've seen in my 11 years here who at least acknowledges that we can't just create more and more and more and more spending forever. He at least acknowledges that there has to be some type of break on the rate of growth, and he at least acknowledges that private sector job creation is the key to Maryland's future. It's economic growth, it's population growth. It's not relying on more government jobs. We do nothing in this state except say, everybody works for the government at some level, and we just assume that that party will keep going forever. It won't. So while we applaud him for that, we have to be honest. This is still a massive tax and spend budget. We are spending more money. We ask very closely the DLS analysts, and they'll tell you this if you ask them themselves. Are we spending more money this year on K-12 education than we spent last year? Yes. Are we spending hundreds of millions more? Are we spending hundreds of millions more on Medicaid than what we spent last year? Yes. Are we hiring more state employees than we hired last year across the board, not just in public safety corrections, across the board? More state employees in this budget? Yes. Are we paying them more money than what we paid them last year? There's no freeze. It's a pay increase. Yes. That's not a cut. It's not a cut when the major drivers of your structural deficit problem are all going up, and Maryland families, businesses, and job creators are asked to pay for it. And that's why we think we need a lot more work in the next 70 days or so, 65, 70 days on this budget. And I'd like to turn it over to my friend, House Minority Whip Jesse Pippy, who's going to talk specifically about some of the tax and fee increases and how they relate to transportation spending in this budget.
Thank you to Delegate Buckle. Look, we finally had an opportunity to digest the governor's budget. As was alluded to, the Secretary of Budget has months and an entire agency to put together the stuff, and then there was a flurry of press releases. This is the other story, right? This is what we needed to cover, because I'll tell you what wasn't put out there was 75-cent delivery fee. So you think about how Marylanders live today, the amount of commerce that is being conducted direct to their homes. Do you think Jeff Bezos is going to pay this 75 cents? No. Marylanders are going to be paying that. So we've now levied a 75-cent fee on probably the majority of everyone we know, right? And this doesn't just Amazon, Walmart, people ordering things from essential services from Walmart and other places. That is a significant thing. Matter of fact, it adds up, projected to $225 million a year. That's a lot. To add insult to injury, the trade allowance was taken away. Now that seems somewhat complicated, but in Maryland, you are only charged 6% of the difference between a vehicle you buy and a vehicle you trade in. So easy math, you buy a $50,000 car, you trade in a $25,000 car, you're taxed on the difference. Gone. Right now, this would only still apply to cars that are $15,000. What EV vehicle can you buy for $15,000 in our state? It's almost contrary to the goal of having X amount of EV cars. So this is some serious stuff. There's 5 million registered vehicles in our state, and all of a sudden now, every single person who purchases a car, minus the folks under 15 grand, are going to pay a 6% higher tax. That's real money. 6% times 25 grand, you do the math, that's real money. That far exceeds that percentage, the 4.74 down to 4.70 tax break that the governor put out there that said 60-some% of all Marylanders are getting a tax break. Well, guess what? When they go buy a vehicle, that's gone. That's gone. It's a wash. And look, we met with the governor this morning. We shared the same concerns. This isn't a personal thing. We just got to be straight with the Maryland people. There are fees, and by the way, registration fees last year doubled. The emissions fees in this proposed budget doubled. So mom and pop, registration fees going up, emission fees doubling, there's no trade-in allowances, you're getting 75 cents on every online delivery. What are we doing? We're making Maryland more unaffordable. And the other inequity I want to talk about, and that's the bottom chart there, is, there's a real injustice for people that have been paying into the system for a long time. I live in Western Maryland. A good amount of my constituents commute. They go to the gas station, they fill up. But by the way, gas tax is tied to inflation. And they're paying into a system that doesn't give them the return. 20 years ago, 50 cents on every dollar that was paid into the system went to infrastructure, roads, things of that nature. That is now dwindled down to 22%. So to reiterate, if you're driving, you're paying taxes, you're paying registration fees, emissions, you're doing all these things that you're supposed to do, the money's not coming back to you. They're not doing road projects. I mean, look, and I'll say this too, because the governor's long-term transportation plan included some funding for roads in 2028. And I don't want to impugn motives, but I mean, that's after the next 2 elections. These are the same projects that were fully funded 6 months ago. The money was taken out because we have no money. And now all of a sudden they're going to be put back in 4 years from now. So this is what we're talking about. At the end of the day, the minority caucuses are looking out for the everyday Marylander that, honestly, the biggest complaint we get is it's unaffordable to live here. And we need to do a better job at living within our means. So there's some other items, but I'd like to introduce Senate Whip Reedy to close this out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. And yes, so what we've got here really is a tale of what's been said versus what has actually been proposed. And we've heard that the talking point that, number one, to start with this chart that we had before, $2 billion in cuts, $1 billion in revenues. We've debunked that. It's $1.3 billion in cuts, none of which are actually cuts to real cuts. It's all a rate of growth moving cuts. And we have basically decided about 40% of this is tax increases, and 22% of the $3 billion is just moving money around. We have this idea that the idea was stated that we're going to cut taxes for 2/3 of Marylanders. No, we're not. Every Marylander will pay more in some sort of tax or fee combined under this budget. Every Marylander. There is no way you can get away with saying that because you got you spend a couple $100 less in your income tax, that makes up for doubling your car registration fee last year and now accelerating it and taking away the ability to pay it in installments, fining you for paying it in installments. There's nothing that's, every Marylander is going to be paying a 75-cent tax on every Amazon delivery, every Papa John's order, and it's tied to inflation. It's actually, in a way, it's outrageous because it's this idea that Marylanders, you want good government, you got to pay for it. You got to pay for it. And we recognize there's some problems, and we're going to make a few changes and tweaks, but we got to pay for it so we can invest more. Why don't we fix what's broken with state government? And that is our addiction to mandated spending and programs that both nearly bankrupt our state's revenue, our state's bank, our state's budget. And then we have the way that we crush businesses and families with the high cost of living and doing business means our economy can't grow. So the governor talks about, and I believe he means it, that he wants to grow the economy, but his idea of growing the economy is basically taxpayers paying more so that we can find a way to invest their money. He's taxing the very people with this $500,000 so-called tax. He's taxing the very people that create the jobs and could invest in growing our economy. And so it's this sort of tale of two budgets. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors. It's saying, well, we recognize we need to make cuts. We just need a little bit of revenues. And the fact is, they're raising taxes and fees on almost, in the last 2 years particularly, on almost everything anybody does in Maryland. And I feel like at times, there's this attitude from Maryland Democrats and the majority party that it's just one more thing. It's just this little more thing here, this more thing here. We're going to give you a little bit back here. We're going to take more over here. Maryland is already one of the most expensive states in the entire country to live in. We're definitely the most expensive state in the region. There's a reason. Delaware is a bright blue state where our now former president's from. They have a surplus. Virginia has a surplus. West Virginia has a surplus. Pennsylvania's balanced. What's going on in Maryland? And I think before anybody asks Maryland families to dig into their pockets more, we should make sure we've got efficient, effective state government. And right now, the Democrats themselves and the governor acknowledge that we have major problems with the Department of Health. We have major issues. The governor, I'm glad he's come forward with some ideas about trying to cut back some on the Kerwin mandates and delay them. We need to go further than his proposal does, but at the very least, he's acknowledging that's a problem. And every day in the committee I sit on, the Senate Finance Committee, we'll have departments coming in supporting bills to add more regulations onto small businesses. So we can't have it both ways. And so while there's some things in the budget proposal that I'm glad that they're trying to tweak, And we obviously support the idea of lowering the corporate tax in a vacuum. You can't say we're going to lower the corporate tax and then do other things over here that increase costs for all the business owners who are LLCs and S-corps. So with that, I would just say in closing, we really need to have a reality-based discussion about how money and our state's budget works. We need to reduce the overall spending, not just fritter around the edges of the rate of growth, but reduce spending and really get our state's budget back under control before we ever think about asking taxpayers who are already crushed with their cost of living to pay more. So with that, we'll be happy to take questions and appreciate